Do you know, Dr. Kale, this cup of tea reminded me of the tea I used to drink at Stampiello's Cafe at Ottawa Square, near the shop of Soso Leafy and Ephraim Solomon for watches. It also reminded me of Sarah and the house in Alzair district.
Unfortunately, my cup of tea reminded me of the tea served by Al-Dayasti Samir at his stand at KFR Abu Agwa. After you enjoy your tea, we can start our session about the intangible assets with indefinite useful lives.
I will be fully attentive to what you are going to say.
An intangible asset with indefinite useful life is not amortized. That is why it is also called an unamortized intangible assets. The carrying amount of an intangible asset with indefinite useful life equals its historical cost, minus any impairment losses.
Is goodwill an intangible asset with an indefinite useful life?
Yes, it is. However, the accounting treatment of goodwill differs from that for other intangible assets. We will discuss the goodwill as an intangible asset in a separate session.
I expect you to talk about the impairment test. Am I correct?
Yes. An intangible asset with indefinite useful life must be reviewed for impairment at least annually. It is tested more often if events or changes in circumstances suggest that the asset may be impaired.
How the impairment test of an intangible asset with indefinite useful life is performed?
An entity may elect to perform qualitative assessment to determine whether a quantitative impairment test is needed. The entity also may directly perform the quantitative test.
What the qualitative assessment is?
After the assessment of qualitative factors, the entity may determine that it is more likely than not that an indefinite long-lived intangible asset is not impaired. More likely than not means that the probability is more than 50%. In this case, the quantitative impairment test is not required. But if potential impairment is found, quantitative impairment test must be performed.
What the quantitative impairment test is?
The carrying amount of an asset is compared with its fair value. If the carrying amount exceeds the fair value, the asset is impaired, and the excess is recognized as impairment losses.
Is this impairment loss reversible, or it is non-reversible?
This impairment loss is non-reversible. The adjusted carrying amount is the new accounting basis.
Are there any differences between US GAAP and IFRS in this connection?
Under IFRS, a one-step quantitative impairment test is performed and no qualitative assessment exists.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid.
Next session, we will discuss goodwill as an intangible asset with indefinite useful life.